Why are cats better than dogs? They're all pretty great, honestly. It's like I'm wearing the cat ears for a game. Was I ever considering making T3-4 Nexus tankier? Possibly. Here's the thing, though. Something we want to avoid is something called trapped games. Trapped games is where you are guaranteed to lose the game, but the game isn't ending. Those suck because you basically create a situation where a bunch of players are in a game that should end and isn't for whatever reason. It's very different, by the way, than a game that someone could come back. Like, I'm not talking about games where you're losing and you can come back. I'm talking about games where you are losing and will not come back, but for whatever reason, the enemy is going to take another 10, 20 minutes to end the game. And so, one of the reasons that we don't make towers giga tanky, you know, there's always some amount of tankiness they need versus squishiness, but one of the reasons to make Nexus towers not as tanky as you perhaps would desire is if the enemy team is at your Nexus towers, it very often indicates a game state where the game should probably end soon. And so making it very, very hard to take your Nexus towers could result in a situation where the game becomes much harder to end and games become more trapped. Why did you remove Skarner's old passive? It was a good idea on paper. It adds a lot of map control and new objectives, and while the new passive is more reliable, it's way less cool. I would argue Skarner's old passive was a very bad idea on paper, actually. I don't think it was a good passive, and I'm glad it's not in the game. And the reason for that is Skarner's passive requires everybody else in the game to play Capture the Flag. And I think that's not something that most champions should do, is have spells on their kit that say, now everybody else has to play this minigame. I think that's fairly... There's a spell like that requires everybody on every team to play a minigame, like Skarner's old passive with the Spires did. I think it has a very big threshold for being worth it, basically. Like, it has to be really, 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 really good to be worth it to have it in the game. And in the case of old Skarner's passive, I don't think it reached that bar. It was like, hey, you're good in certain areas. For a lot of Skarner players, I would argue that felt like a punishment. And what I mean by that is Skarner's good in certain areas. Cool. You know where Nocturne is good? All the areas. You know where Vi is good? All the areas. Right? And so I think one of the things that was rough about Skarner's Spires is you have to play a mini game to get them. And the result is, yes, you are strong in this area, but you are not, like, insanely strong. You're not like, wow, now I'm Kale in this area. No, it's just, you're, like, kind of, like, slightly above base level. And so I think the end result of that passive was everybody had to play in a mini game for an effect that ended up in a number of times making Skarner feel like he had to jump through hoops that no one else had to jump through. So that's kind of my thought about that. What about Kindred's marks? I think Kindred marks are much less of a mini game because Kindred marks are like natural gameplay. What I mean by that is, yes, don't let Kindred get the mark, duh, but you're already supposed to not let her steal your jungle. You're already supposed to not let her kill you, right? And so while there is a mini game present, the changes in gameplay that it requires are significantly less than something like Skarner's passive. Because it's keying on to gameplay you're already doing naturally, which is don't let people take these camps and take your life. And then additionally, Kindred's reward for playing that minigame is pretty substantial. Kindred gets a ton of range, a ton of power for playing that minigame. And so I think that minigame ends up feeling, for Kindred and for her teammates and for her enemies, just everybody involved, significantly more worth it to engage in as well. Because the result of it is incredibly transformational and powerful. What does sudden impact not have a UI for CD? It's not valuable to create a UI for something that doesn't change your gameplay. Right? So does sudden impact have a UI, have a CD? Yes. Would it really matter at all, given it kind of just happens in the course of your natural gameplay pattern and honestly doesn't add that much damage? Right? And so the thing is like there's a lot of runes that yes, we could give them UI, yes, we could give them icons, but the amount of power in the runes is not really worth the UI space they take up. So Sudden's Impact's an example of something that, like, yes, you could have just permanent icons constantly ticking on your character, showing you when it's up and when it's coming down and things like that, but like that's not really worth displaying for the amount of gameplay power it has and for the amount of change that most players would ever do to their gameplay to take advantage of it. Then make the UI customizable. You say that as it's something we could just snap our fingers and make happen, right? Giving players infinite options is not always the right way to go about things, especially if there's a lot of resources that go into working it. League's UI tends to be very inflexible, so making it super customizable is not necessarily something that's super straightforward to do. Why are you low elo when you know so much about the game, noob? Well, for starters, Emerald isn't low elo. It's pretty decent. It's pretty good. It's like top, like, what, 5% of players? And secondarily, I'm normally a Diamond 2 player when I actually play the game, which is even higher. My peak rank was top 1600 NA, so I'm actually pretty good if I tried, but I have a life, unfortunately. One thing I think is always a little silly is when people say Diamond isn't high MMR. So yes, Diamond is trash compared to Master Tier, and Master Tier is trash compared to Challenger, and Challenger is trash compared to Pro Play. But at the end of the day, high Diamond players are insanely good at the game compared to everybody else. And their experiences in the game are vastly different than 95 to 99% of the other players. So I would not necessarily go around calling Diamond low MMR. I would not agree with that statement. It's definitely not Apex tier. It's definitely not as good as a Challenger player. But Diamond players are head and shoulders above the vast, vast majority of players. You were top 7.6%? Yeah, I gotta get that number up, dude. I have not been playing. And it shows! Sag.